All right, it looks like most folks are in. We may continue to have some joining us in progress, but I'm going to turn us over to Kate Markert, who will get us started this evening.
Thank you so much, Erin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. It's especially nice to reunite with so many of our members. And I'd also like to share a special welcome for members of the Preservation Society of Newport, Rhode Island, who are here thanks to a new partnership that Hillwood has with the Society to share our online lectures with each other's audiences. Thank you for inviting us into your home tonight. In celebration of Bastille Day, Chief Curator Wilfried Zeisler and Assistant Curator of Apparel, Jewelry, and Accessories, Megan Martinelli, will discuss the avid admiration Hillwood's founder, Marjorie Merriweather Post, held for French culture. Her passion for collecting was sparked with 18th century French art, although she later embraced Russian imperial art. I invite you all to explore her resulting collection, a masterful blend of decorative arts and exquisite craftsmanship. I'm so pleased that now we can welcome back visitors to Hillwood's 25-acre estate. In order to minimize physical contact, we do require visitors to make reservations in advance and select an entrance time to visit the gardens, mansion, or the special exhibition, Natural Beauties, Exquisite Works of Minerals and Gems. For more information, including temporary visitor guidelines, you can find them all on our website, hillwoodmuseum.org. I also hope to be with you virtually when we continue to gather for programs. We have lectures, family tours, and floral design workshops all coming up. Without further ado, I'll turn you over to Wilfried Zeisler as he begins our tour through Paris of the early to mid 20th century. Megan Martinelli will speak next, followed by plenty of time to answer your questions. Please make yourself comfortable. Your cameras and microphones are not active, but we do want to hear from you. Our moderator will make sure we get to questions at the end, so please send them through Zoom's Q&A feature. You can see right there on screen how to submit questions from a computer and from mobile devices. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Hillwood's Chief Curator, Dr. Wilfried Zeisler.
Good evening, everyone. So it's my pleasure to be with you tonight and to invite you with Megan to pack, actually, and to follow for sort of serious shopping tour of Paris all together tonight with, of course, Marjorie Post, who, as Kate mentioned, was a known collector of French art, French decorative art, but also French luxury goods. But before we embark to this journey to Paris, I would like to give you more of a background of why Paris has always been so appealing and why we like so much to go to Paris and to do shopping there. I will use a few examples from our collection to start this presentation and to give you sort of background about this attraction we all have for Paris. Actually, everything kind of began progressively in the 17th century with the development, with the support of the French court, and especially the kings, and especially Louis XIV, for French art and French luxury goods and decorative arts. Indeed, in the 17th century, factories, national manufacturers were developed, and also a lot of artisans, craftsmen from all over Europe, especially from the Netherlands and from Germany, were invited to come to Paris to work for the court, but also to bring their knowledge, their skills to be mixed with French traditions so that a national industry and luxury good industry could be developed and became progressively successful all over Europe and followed as a model for the other courts in Europe. And as an example of that success in our collection, I would like to show you this piece of furniture from the 18th century, which was part of Marjorie Post's collection, which is a late 18th century commode or chest of drawers, which was made by one of maybe one of the most famous cabinet maker in late 18th century France, who was known for these kind of lavish, luxurious pieces of furniture, mixing marquetry and gilt bronze, as you can see on this slide here. What is interesting is that Jean-Henri Riesner was actually from Germany, and that's a good example of how actually bringing in these skillful artisans to France was a way to create in Paris a hub for the luxury good industry. And here it was a sort of mix of the technique of marquetry, which was an old German and Netherlands tradition, with gilt bronze, especially casting, chasing, and gilding, which was a very strong French tradition. And this was also a great success because of the very well organized system of guilds for each kind of like type of craftsmanship. And the intermediary between these artisans and between the artisans themselves and the luxury good and the clientele was actually the fact that they were like a special guild named as the Merchant of Luxury, who were playing using their network among artisans and their networks among clients to sell and propose these precious objects to a local clientele, of course, the French court, but also to foreigners. And that's a sort of like background of this very old tradition and success of French luxury goods and decorative arts, not only in France, but also abroad. And in our collection, since Marjorie Post is mostly known for two main collections, a French 18th century collection and a Russian art collection, we have examples of French luxury goods which were successful in Russia. And here we have a very nice example on this slide, which is some silver gilt pieces from the set which was made in Paris by the firm of Ocock, which was one of the most famous jeweler in the 19th century in Paris, who was known for the traveling sets he was producing. And this piece was acquired by a member of the imperial family, and you can see a portrait of Princess Elena Pavlovna, who commissioned it in the mid-19th century, and on that portrait on the left. And what I like about this piece is like it's typically French, but it was customized for the client. And you can see it's featured here by the presence of the Russian crown, topped by the double-headed eagle, which is a symbol of Imperial Russia. But it shows well the success of these objects abroad. Another example I would like to show you before we follow Marjorie Post in her shopping day in Paris is actually another aspect of the success of French luxury goods, which is, of course, jewelry. And in our collection, we have this very beautiful pocket watch made of gold, diamonds, and rubies. And this pocket watch was made by the firm of Boucheron, a jeweler which still exists today. And here, as you can see, it has two L made of rubies here, which was the monogram of Mademoiselle Loos, who was actually a dancer at the in France in the late 19th century, and who commissioned this piece from Boucheron. Boucheron was actually a very successful jeweler in the late 19th century, established his firm in 1858. And his firm was actually established in the center of the luxury good industry in Paris in the first half of the 19th century, which was the Palais Royal. And here you can see that building, which still exists today, which was actually a former royal residence and which had, alongside the garden, galleries in which had flourished actually the luxury good industry in France since the early 19th century, and particularly during the first half of the 19th century. And this brings me to the map of Paris. Here is actually the map of central Paris, how it looked like during the time of Marjorie Post in the 2030s, how it still looked like. And basically, it shows you where all these luxury good industry were located. The Palais Royal is right here. And this was actually in the center of the city where actually flourished traditionally this merchant of luxury, these luxury good shops, especially in the 18th century on the Rue Saint-Honoré or Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré here, and which was logic because those shops were actually not so far from the Louvre and the Tuileries Palace, which was used to be here, next to the foreign embassies, next to mansions, so very next to the clientele. And here you can see that this center of Paris, which has not changed, will be and is still today the center of luxury good industry. Here, for example, it's just to show you what trip we will do through Paris, all the firms we will explore today with Marjorie Post. And as you can see, none of them is in the Palais Royal, because, as I said, Palais Royal was very fashionable in the first half of the 19th century, but Marjorie Post, born in 1887 and died in 1973, she traveled especially in France in the first half of the 20th century, and progressively with the development of Paris, especially during the Second Empire, the luxury good industry moved towards west, as you can see very clearly here, especially around the Rue de la Paix and the Place Vendôme, which was in the early 20th century really the center of French luxury good industry, with not only jewelers as it is today, but also fashion designer, accessory designer, also antique dealers, and so on. And progressively, especially the fashion, moved toward west because this atelier needed more space for their workshops, and that's why they moved more towards Avenue Montaigne or Avenue des Champs-Élysées, as you can see here. So it's very nice to follow Marjorie Post here through these different addresses and boutique and shops, because it shows you also the evolution of the luxury good industry during the 20th century. So before we start to actually do shopping, we have to cross the Atlantic. So I hope you are all ready to follow me and follow Marjorie Post. So here is a photo of Marjorie Post at age 15, around 1902, when she traveled to Europe from the US. It's not a trip she did in 1902 to France, but she traveled a lot actually in the early 20th century with her father, especially to England and other European countries. But I will show you that she was traveling in very famous liners during her lifetime. So, for example, in 1922, she embarked on the Olympic. The Olympic was a very famous ship from the Star Line, White Star Line company, which was actually the exact copy of the more famous Titanic, which we all know what happened to it. But this ship was a replica of the Titanic, and it was a typical example of the Gilded Age. And here you can see the example of the famous staircase from the Olympic, which is identical to the ones which once adorned the Titanic. And then another example of a famous ship that Marjorie Post embarked on is the famous Queen Mary, which she was on in 1938, going to France. And this one, also very famous, epitomized actually the development of the Art Deco style, as you can see from this photo on the left. And somehow these two ships give a frame of our time period, which is like the Gilded Age and the Art Deco period. So the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s later on, that Marjorie Post used to travel a lot to France. So when you go to Paris, when she arrived to Paris, you needed, of course, a good and a nice accommodations. So among the different hotels that Marjorie Post visited, you had, of course, the Ritz Hotel here on Place Vendôme, which is still there, of course, and which was logically located not so far from all these luxury goods shops, as you can see on this map. She would also stay at the Claridge on the Champs-Élysées, as you can see here, or at the Hotel Raphael here on the Avenue Kléber. Here are some photos of those hotels, like the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme, the Raphael Avenue Kléber, the Claridge on the Champs-Élysées. And what I like is like here is a detail from one of Marjorie Post's trunks, which still has a label on which is written down the address of the Ritz in Paris where her trunks had to be delivered. So when you are like, when you cross the Atlantic, when you are well accommodated in a good hotel in Paris, so what do? Of course, you will first visit the sightseeings of the city. So here from one of the early 20th century scrapbook from Marjorie Post, you can see some of the famous buildings she visited, such as this, the Louvre here, and she write down end of the Louvre on that photo here, or like, of course, the Grand Opera, so Grand Opera House, as you can see here, and a photo of her and the group who was traveling with her, including her father here, making in front of the restaurant they went to in Fontainebleau in a suburb of Paris in 1904. Of course, you will also go to Paris to attend special events and visit international fairs. And actually, Megan will tell you more about Marjorie Post's visit to the 1900 World Fair, but I wanted to show you actually her visit in 1937 to the fair, famous international fair in Paris. And here you have pages from her scrapbooks and with the Eiffel Tower and details of the buildings she visited, like the monument of Soviet Russia and the monument of Nazi Germany. And actually, between 1937 and 1939, Marjorie Post spent a lot of time visiting Europe and especially Paris because her husband, Joe Davis, at that time, was the ambassador of America in Moscow and then Brussels. So it made easier for her to visit Paris. And what I liked, I showed here next to the 1937 visit to the exhibition, that piece from our collection, which is maybe the most modern piece of design we have in our collection, which is by Saint-Gobain. Saint-Gobain was a glass manufacturer which was actually originally founded in the 17th century and known for the new technology of doing mirrors. And here they developed new technology and new design and using glass and metal to create a heater, as you can see here, which was one of the first time it was shown to the public was in 1937, and most likely it inspired Marjorie Post, who may have bought it after the visit of the exhibition. But she would also come to Paris, of course, to enjoy the social life in Paris. As she stated in August 1937, quote, "Paris is very gay and crowded," end of quote, in one of her scrapbooks. She would also take the opportunity of visit her daughters, Eleanor. Eleanor actually settled in Paris in the late 30s, and she actually married for a few months in 1933 in Paris. And you can see here this photograph taken in Paris at the occasion of her wedding to French citizens. And when she settled in Paris, she actually bought and owned a mansion in Paris and a little country house, not very little, but a country house in a suburb of Paris, at Vaux-sur-Seine. Here at the Pavillon d'Artois, which once was owned by the brother of Louis XVI, future King Charles X, and which were actually these homes where Eleanor showed her collection. I mean, following the model of her mother, she was a collector of 18th century French art, but she was also a great hostess, as shown by these photos from a party she gave and that Marjorie Post attended in Paris in the 50s or 60s. And while visiting for the first time her house in Paris in 1938, Marjorie Post said in one of her scrapbooks about this visit, quote, "Visiting in my daughter's house for the first time. An altogether delightful experience. Eleanor is a grand little homemaker. The house is a jewel of taste, charm, and beauty," end of quote. And with her, she will of course do shopping. She will also attend parties and different, events such as fundraisers. And here you have an example of a fundraiser which was organized in 1949 for the benefit of Versailles that Marjorie Post attended. It was organized within the private theater of Queen Marie Antoinette. And here you can see a detail there. You have Marjorie Post and her daughter Eleanor enjoying this typically Parisian evening. Again, sometimes Marjorie Post will organize a party herself, like here at the Ritz Hotel in June 1951. She will hire actually a famous Parisian interior designer to bring plants, flowers, and arrange everything, draperies at the Ritz Hotel to host a party for over 60 people, which include, of course, diplomats, aristocrats, the Café Society of Paris of the period, and of course the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And you have here photos of the couple in 1948, and they were actually friends of Marjorie Post. But of course, shopping, visiting was not, sorry, and social life was not the only occupation of Marjorie Post in Paris. She will also do some shopping, and especially in the 30s, to buy objects for her collection, but also to furnish her homes. And she would visit between 37 and 39, right after she actually fell in love with Russian culture, two antique dealers on the Rue Saint-Honoré and Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, à la Vieille Russie and La Galerie d'Art Ancien, which were both specialized in Russian works of art. Marjorie Post began collecting Russian art in Russia, of course, at that time, but she will continue in France, in Paris, and a large portion actually of our Russian art collection came from Paris and was acquired from these two dealers. And here I have a few examples I wanted to show you of the kind of thing that she bought while in Paris, antiquing on the Rue Saint-Honoré. From the Galerie d'Art Ancien, which was owned by Königsberg, a dealer from Russian origin. She bought a lot of porcelain that she began to collect in Russia, actually, and she was gathering enough pieces of these services to be set on her table. And a few years later, in 1939, as you can see here, she had enough of this Russian porcelain to set a formal dinner at the American Embassy in Brussels. She would also acquire what she always loved to collect, Russian imperial portraitures. And here you have another example of portraits she bought from Königsberg, from Galerie d'Art Ancien, which features Paul I, Emperor of Russia, and his wife, Empress Maria Fedorovna. Marjorie Post was also a known collector of textile, and when focusing on Russian art, she would of course collect Russian textile. And here you have one of our rare piece of Russian tapestry featuring the Russian coat of arms that she always had in her icon room, her sort of chamber of treasures in her different homes, including at Hillwood, displayed. And this piece she bought from the same dealer. But she was not forgetting, of course, her passion and interest for France. And from the same dealer, she bought actually this bust after work by Houdon, featuring the famous French philosopher Voltaire, and also this 18th century French lapis lazuli and gilt bronze vase. But by choosing these pieces, she was also developing her interest for the French-Russian connection, since she was aware of the relationship developed by Voltaire with Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, and of course, the love of lapis lazuli in Russia and hearthstone in Russia. And she had visited, actually, while in Russia, the lapis lazuli room in one of the imperial palaces in a suburb of St. Petersburg. She also bought from the same dealer this beautiful portrait after Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the famous French portraitist of the late 18th century, a portrait of Queen Marie Antoinette of France. So her passion for France again, but also her passion for Russia, because this piece came from a Russian collection. And she will buy the same kind of art from another important dealer, I said, after la Galerie de l'Art Ancien, à la Vieille Russie, which is still today a very famous antique dealer specialized in Russian works of art and Fabergé. But this dealer had a very old story. I mean, à la Vieille Russie was founded in Russia, actually, at that time Russia, now Ukraine, in Kiev in 1851. He was an antique dealer. And after the Russian Revolution, the shop was moved to Paris in 1921 and became particularly famous. And it reminds us that until the Second World War, Paris was one of the most important centers in the world of the art market. And here are examples of the objects like Marjorie Post bought from La Vieille Russie, such as this beautiful French pocket watch with a portrait of the Emperor of Russia, Nikolai I, this Russian box made of gold and turquoise from the same antique dealer, La Vieille Russie. And then another portrait, very rare, exquisite portrait of Countess Branica, who was one of the nieces of Potemkin. Potemkin was the favorite lover of Catherine the Great. She was also the sister of Princess Yusupova, so it's a key person in the cultural history in Russia, and she bought that portrait in the 30s from La Vieille Russie in Paris. But of course, she was not only buying antiques while in Paris, she was also buying jewelry and precious objects. And here we will just explore three firms. Of course, so Keller here, Avenue Matignon, Bois-Taburet, Boulevard Malesherbes, and finally Cartier on the Rue de la Paix, the famous firm. So here, Keller was actually a very good example of the continuation of this old tradition in the luxury good, in the French luxury good industry, and inviting, foreign artisans. And Keller originally was from Germany and settled in Paris in the mid-19th century and became very quickly successful. It showed also how Paris was a land of opportunities for skillful artisans. And Keller became famous for doing this very exquisite, modern, practical, and elegant traveling sets made of silver. And here you have one that she commissioned, Marjorie Post, and with the Hutton coat of arms, which were the coat of arms she had while married to E.F. Hutton in the 20s. So, and here is one of the invoice from the 20s from Keller in Paris. She will also, speaking of traveling sets, she had almost one made for each of her weddings. She had some from Keller, as we just saw. She had some from Cartier, from Gorham. And here is the latest she ordered. She commissioned from Bois-Taburet, another famous jeweler in Paris, who was founded in 1860, who was still active until the mid-20th century. And when she got married in 58 with Herbert May, Marjorie Post ordered from Paris this time another traveling set, but this time not in silver, but made of solid gold with a monogram of diamond and rubies. And this set, unfortunately, is not in our collection anymore. And we hope that we will find it one day. But it's a wonderful example of the kind of commission that she continued her entire life to do in Paris. And finally, of course, she went often to the Rue de la Paix, the center of the luxury good industry in France, and she will buy from Cartier. Cartier was a very famous, and still today, very famous jeweler, which was originally founded in 1847, but established his boutique Cartier in Rue de la Paix starting in 1899. And the shop was very successful. And Marjorie Post, of course, is known for her collection of jewelry coming from Cartier, but she would buy her jewelry mostly from the branch that the firm had opened in New York starting in 1909. And so that's why we won't show you so much jewelry tonight because from Cartier, because most of it was coming from the New York branch. But still, she was visiting the shop in Paris, as you can see it here, as Mrs. Hutton and then as Mrs. Davis, and she commissioned a few exquisite frames, as you can see here, with a portrait of herself, of her young daughter, Dina Merrill, with made of like semi-precious materials such as agate or lapis lazuli here. And of course, after doing so much shopping, you need wonderful trunks to carry all your new acquisitions. And of course, Marjorie Post was a very important client of the firm of Louis Vuitton, which was established in Paris in 1854. And here you have an example of the few pieces we still have in our collection. She ordered between the 20s and the 40s almost 40 trunks from Louis Vuitton. And these were, of course, customized for her. And you can see here this trunk you can open, has little drawers, a special space for hats. And all of them have a number which gives you a sense of how many trunks she had. Here you can see 57, and also her initials, and showing the quality of these trunks. So originally they were commissioned to be Marjorie Post Hutton, and then the H became a D, Davis, and then the D became an M, May, and finally a black square, Marjorie Post only, for the rest of her life. And here I wanted to show you another of our trunks, which is, I think, very interesting. As you can see, all of the Louis Vuitton trunks are always very well marked. Here you have a detail of the LV on this piece, which is a shoe trunk. And each of these little drawers is actually made to put your shoes, some labels so that you know where they are. And believe me, we will need these trunks to follow Megan through her tour of the fashion designer and accessory makers that Marjorie Post visited while in Paris. So now I leave the floor to Megan.
And Megan, I'm going to pop in real quickly and say that I've gotten a couple of notes that folks were having a little trouble hearing Wilfried. We are doing our best to help boost that sound volume, but if you could speak up, I would appreciate it.
All right, so can everyone hear me now? Hello, good evening, and thank you, Wilfried. And I would also like to say hello to folks in Rhode Island who have signed in from the Newport Preservation Society. If you don't know, I'm a native Rhode Islander, so it's very exciting to know that people from my home state are logging in. You know, I hope nobody gets jet lagged, and we're ready to get started. So without further ado, let's go shopping. All right, so as Wilfried mentioned, whoops, hold up, going back. Okay, I will actually not use the remote. Sorry. Okay, so as Wilfried mentioned, I am going to start with the World Fair in 1900, which was actually Marjorie Post's first trip abroad with her father and her mother. Is there a way we can trying to go back to that first slide actually, but I will just continue. So Marjorie Post traveled to Paris and Europe with her mother and father at age 13 and attended the Exposition Universelle. She was 13 at the time. Apologies for speaking a little quickly as I work out the kinks in the presentation. She was 13 years old at the time, and I think this was a very formative event for her in her development as a collector, as a shopper, and as a consumer of fine jewelry. So it seems like a perfect place to start our tour of French fashion and jewelry. So Madame Paquin opened her salon in Paris in 1891, and in the early 20th century, she was regarded as the queen of fashion. Everybody wanted to be dressed by her, and her inspiration was initially drawn on the 18th century in France. She was working with a lot of pastels. There was ribbon flowers and very fine silks, but Paquin also took on a major role at the French World Fair in 1900 that you see here that I just mentioned that Post attended. She actually designed the gown worn on the sculpture, this 15-foot sculpture that greeted you as you entered the area in Paris where this fair was held. And so that alone should signify to you her importance and her visibility in French design during this time period. She also was the president of the entire fashion section of this exhibition universelle. So if we move into this next slide, so there was an entire pavilion dedicated to threads, textiles, and clothes, showcasing modern fashion designers with their works displayed on wax mannequins. So in this particular example that we're looking at, you can see Gustave Bier's booth, who I'll get to in a moment, and Jean Paquin's booth. She also advised for the Palais du Costume. So this is a historic costume exhibition space that was set up for the 1900 World's Fair. So in this instance, again, we're seeing a model wearing an actual 18th century gown. And all of these sights and sounds were the kind of things that Marjorie first encountered while in Paris. She grew up, as you may know, in the Midwest, and then began to travel very regularly with her family as her father's company took off. So a second trip occurred a few years later, and I would like to just say that the scrapbooks that are held at the University of Michigan's archives, their historic library collection, actually feature all of her girlhood scrapbooks. So she documented and kept some clippings of some of the things that she saw, the historical sites, some of the performances she took in. She went to the Marigny Theater, for instance, and saw the vaudeville star Ida Fuller. She also went to Chateau Chanceau and admired the Salon of Louis XIV and kept a postcard and memento in her scrapbook, as well as this kind of Mucha-esque program for the Marigny Theater. So she was a great cataloger of her experiences, and this is a really wonderful way to understand how she was interacting with Paris and interacting with fashion during this time period in her life. So thanks to Wilfried for organizing this walking tour of Paris for us. So we're at the Yellow Dot in the Place Vendôme, and we're on our way to Gustave Bier's atelier. And he was one of the first designers to move into the Place. So let's get started, and I have made a kind of exciting discovery for Gustave Bier that I'm looking forward to sharing. So as I mentioned, Post probably saw Gustave Bier's booth when she was in Paris for the 1900 World's Fair. He was one of the grand couturiers who was very prominently featured. Bier, we don't know very much about him at the moment. We do know that he was born in Germany, and he himself was enamored with French 18th century, just like Paquin. It seemed like the late 19th century French designers found themselves drawing inspiration from this period. And he was known for creating custom pieces for a very exclusive clientele. A few fashion guides from the time period refer to him as one of the most expensive couturiers of the time. He dressed the Empress of Germany and the Queen of Portugal, and apparently he also dressed Marjorie Post, which is a new discovery on our part. I mentioned her scrapbooks earlier. We have a few at Hillwood that have been digitized, and this page is an example with a note referring to what we previously believed was a costume that she wore in 1924 and later again in 1926 to be Marie Antoinette. This costume, actually, according to Postscript, was a beer original that was then reworked 20 years later. And I think it's so fantastic that even though it doesn't have a beer label, I'm able to compare it to other extant garments in collections at the Frick Pittsburgh, for example. And I've seen a few, or one that is very similar in style and time period at Philadelphia Museum of Art. So finding this key and discovering that this is one of the costumes that Marjorie Post purchased as a young woman in Paris with her family and then came back to for her costume as Marie Antoinette is very exciting. And you can see the silhouette is not quite, definitely not 20s, and certainly a little more Edwardian with true inspiration with these side panniers and the tiers of lace, for example, that kind of pull you into the 18th century by Gustave Bier's work. So again, we know these are documented instances of her wearing this gown. On the far right, she's wearing it in an illustration in Harper's Bazaar, featuring her at the May 24th costume ball. She is illustrated by a famous cartoonist named Ralph Barton in that rendering. On the left, in the center, she's fully decked out with her very close friend, the actor Billy Burke, who later would go on to become Glinda the Good Witch. But in the 20s, she was married to Florence Ziegfeld, and her influence on Marjorie Post fashion is a totally different presentation, but there they are together at the ball. And then most recently, we were fortunate to have the costume go on loan to Versailles for the Versailles Revival exhibition, which opened in November 2019 and continued through March. So here is a picture of the costume returned to France, and I'm sure that Gustave Bier would appreciate its surrounds at the Palace of Versailles, since he was so inspired by that period in his work. Next, we're going to head into one of the great retail emporiums of the period, which of course, Bon Marché. It is unclear if this beautiful silk visiting dress and the accompanying jacket was worn by Post or her mother. We have a date of about 1906, and the other feature that I just want to draw your attention to is, you know, it was designed in-house for Bon Marché, but what I love about the gusset details that you can't see in the picture of the jacket, but I included a detail, this kind of this network of woven silk ribbons really evokes the ironwork in the center of the store, and how beautiful it is. And I just wanted to share this as one really great early example of French design in our collection. And it's a great emblem of the retail revolution that happened with the development of department stores in Paris in the mid-19th century. And as they evolved into this luxury emporium, shopping as leisure and the impulse buy, of course, but this seems to have been anything but an impulse. So as we move through the city, we are now headed to the ateliers, milliner ateliers of Caroline Reboux and Madame Georgette. And these are two hats that we haven't really looked at in the collection before. They're both from around the same time period and feature for example, in the case of Reboux, it features handmade lace and these silk hydrangeas. The Madame Georgette is earlier and really actually stunningly executed ribbon flowers and this very still, for its age, lush plume of ostrich feather poking out of the metallic lace of this hat. So these are two exclusive milliners that in Reboux's case existed well into the 20th century in terms of women continuing to wear hats into the 50s and 60s. But moving on again, another accessory in our collection with French provenance is this incredible fan, which we recently attributed to the watercolorist Madeleine Lemaire, who was known for obviously painting these very exquisite fans for firms like Rodin, apologies, and it's interesting because Lemaire is an associate and friend of Marcel Proust, and she actually hosted him at many of her famous salons and was kind of part of the Belle Epoque networking and scene that he was also a part of. So now, speaking of Proust, he did have some words for the firm of Calosaire. These are, this of course is Grand Couturier house founded by 4 sisters, and Proust is known to have said that they kind of go in a bit too much with lace. Of course, using antique lace is their signature. There's a little bit seen here in the bodice of our Calosaire gown from about 1908. We're lucky that this Calosaire is pretty representative of what the firm was doing in the early 20th century by featuring trim and all this kind of embroidery, exotic embroidery, very fine silk and cotton moire. They were known for just layers of beautiful sheer fabrics, and you see that here. We're also looking at the ribbon work around the skirts. This is a wonderful example of Calosaire's designs and output from the period. So, like many women, and I'm sure that people understand that fashion in the early 20th century was a bit difficult because New York was still relying quite largely on haute couture or grand couturiers. It wasn't couture at the time, but working with smaller firms in New York, Marjorie Post would have replicas made either with labels or based on sketches or based on models that had been imported. So if we're looking at this invoice from her scrapbook from around, the mid 1900s, copy of a Calo in white, you can see the 4th line up, or copy Paquin, evening in blue. We don't, unfortunately, those pieces aren't in the collection, but we do know that Hitchens and Balcombe in Midtown Manhattan was importing and creating replicas of some of these French designs. With that in mind, I'm showing you someone, Paul Poiret, who came into kind of his own in the 19-teens and is known for this tunic and harem ensemble. We're looking at a costume from the Met that was created for his famous 1002nd Night Party at the center of this slide here. And then we're looking at a very cool representation of his wife, Denise, that was done by Georges Lepape in 1911, kind of commemorating her on that night. And then on the left, we have from Marjorie Post's scrapbook a picture of her and a friend in a very Poiret-esque costume. I will say, we don't, unfortunately, that costume does not survive, but we're very fortunate to have this example of her experimenting with this new style of dress brought on by the French designer Poiret. Just to jump in, it's not a pin, it's actually stitched onto the dress as an ornament, and it's brass, and it's in wonderful condition regarding the Calisser gown that I just showed a moment ago. So again, you know, now we're moving into the 20s. We've gone through with the kind of copying or import, if you will, into the 1920s. Marjorie Post was really setting the scene. She had a home in New York. As Wilfried mentioned later, her daughter would locate in the early 30s to Paris and buy a home there and marry. But I include, and I'm sorry that it is a photocopy, but I include this wonderful 1928 feature on Marjorie Post, just a little blurb that says that she was voted the most beautiful grandmother in Paris, and that she had been kind of staying for an extended period of time in 1928 in Paris, which I just love, that she was voted the most beautiful grandmother. And then we're looking here at her 1920 passport, which is outlining a pretty seemingly whirlwind trip abroad to Europe. She's going to the British Isles, she is going to France, Belgium, and she's planning on visiting friends and vacation. So now we are actually going to the short-lived atelier of Madeleine and Madeleine. And this has another interesting little connection to New York fashion and copies, which I love to talk about. And here we go. So many people probably are aware that in 1914, Edna Woolman Chase, who was then the American editor of Vogue, found herself kind of at a crossroads in terms of the First World War and her concern about being able to show designs in the pages of Vogue to her American clients. And she was inspired by her friend Henri Bendel, who of course established the very famous store in New York, and decided that it would be a great idea to invite American designers to be inspired by French design and have a fashion show with society women, which is the first of its kind, and a good way, kind of almost a first instance too of clients and designers getting together and interacting in one place. And it was very successful. It was copied many times. It was intended to raise money for devastated France, and it happened again and again, at least 3 or 4 times, also in Newport, which, hello Newport. But Marjorie Post participated in one, probably not necessarily sanctioned by Vogue, but organized by Anne Morgan, who was a society woman who was very involved with devastated France and keeping the Allies in shape in World War I funded. So Marjorie Post modeled for a 1920 fashion show, and that was held at the Hotel Commodore in New York. And you see the 2 pictures on either side of the slide are clippings of her wearing a gown that was made by the firm Kurtzman, which was also in Midtown, also very exclusive, also known for importing French design. If you look closely, you'll see that the tulle is a different color than the tulle that is in on the dress that's featured at the center of the slide that's in our collection. And the brocade pattern differs slightly. So this dress that we're looking at in the center is a near twin of the dress that she wore for this American fashion show. However, this dress has a label from a very short-lived, kind of rare fashion firm that was started by 2 cousins. Both of them were named Madeleine, and they took inspiration from Egyptian design and Chinese and Asian and Japanese design, and we're again kind of embracing the globalization in fashion inspiration that was continuing to happen during this time period. And I'm not 100% clear on how, if Marjorie just purchased the model for the dress that she wore and got the Parisian import, or if she had the dress before. We don't have invoices, but we do know that she modeled the copy of the dress in this particular fashion show, which I think is very fun. Another instance of import is, just very quickly, this is also a new discovery. Madame Thurn was another exclusive importer, and in the teens, she was indeed accused of copying French designs or importing pieces illegally. There's a whole New York Times back and forth about her, but she kind of rebranded, dropped the Madame from the name, and in this instance, I'm quite comfortable attributing these two ensembles to Natalia Gonkarova, who designed for Mirbour, which was a firm set up by Madame Catoli in Paris, and her aim was to kind of bring the experience of the Ballet Russe with many different avant-garde designers into the fashion and home decor world. So that this particular firm of Mirbour in Paris was selling rugs and pieces designed by Picasso and Lucat, and also Natalia Gonkarova, who of course is a Russian avant-garde artist known for collaborating with the Ballet Russe on designs and sets, but also known for designing for Mirbour. So I believe that these two ensembles, along with this third one, were all imported by Thurn. Some of them have labels that are Thurn, some of them don't. None have Mirbour labels, but I do know Mirbour pieces very well from previous research, and I do know that many don't have labels. So we're still in the Mirbour area, sorry. And so, here's just what their designs were like, what Gonkarova's designs for the firm were like. And I like that Mirbour designs clothes for the woman who seeks an expression of personality in her gowns, which I think is very true for Marjorie Post. So finally, another cool little story of Marjorie in the 20s and 30s is that she was photographed by Dora Calmou, or Madame Dora, as she styled herself, who moved to Paris in the early 1920s. And you see her self-portrait at the center of the slide, and another compelling portrait of Chanel early or later in the 20s on this slide. But the three up there are Marjorie Post, and we know one of them is probably about 1928, and then we know that she came back to the studio with her daughter Eleanor in Eleanor's wedding gown, which Wilfried mentioned during his leg of the presentation. Eleanor married in 1933. In 1933, she wore this blue Caliseur gown that we are fortunate to have in the collection. Of course, Caliseur, all of the sisters had passed by then, and this gown is kind of just in the death rattle of the firm, as it was kind of taken over by one of the nephews or sons of the four sisters. So it wasn't successful into the 30s, but I think it's wonderful that we have this last example, and that Post kept coming back to her favorite designers that she may have seen while at the Exhibition Universelle. So if we just run back into Pecan, because we haven't left Pecan, because I know everybody's probably wondering why I emphasize her so much at the beginning. Well, I think that Marjorie Post kept Pecan in her mind. And when she was married to her third husband, Joseph Davies' middle daughter, Emlyn Knight Davis, was about to get married. And during the time, Marjorie and her husband, Joseph Davies, were actually in Brussels because he was the American ambassador to Brussels at that moment. And you can see in her scrapbook that she's remembering or chronicling her work with her I guess stepdaughter, for lack of a better word, going to the Atelier of Pecan, which was actually then under one of Pecan's former assistants. Pecan has passed away at this point already, but it's one of her assistants who has taken on the firm and designed this very simple silk taffeta empire waist gown with full sleeves and wax flowers and silk ribbons. And maybe Marjorie was inspired by the Callisers, but she was always adding antique pieces of lace to special gowns that she would collect. So in this instance, she purchased a piece of Belgian lace and had that added to the gown as well. So now we will move into the 1930s, further through the 1930s, and look at two gowns by Robert Piguet, who was born in Switzerland and opened shop in Paris in 1933. And one of his assistants in 1933 through about 1937 was Christian Dior, prior to him establishing his own firm after the war in 1947. So here you see a picture of Piguet with Dior, and Dior credits his time with Robert Piguet, who now, his firm was very short-lived as well, but you may know his fragrances, which still live on, as they often do. Christian Dior credits Piguet for kind of giving him the taste for elegance and simplicity in design. And I think that's pretty apparent by these gowns, which look deceptively simple, but are all constructed of strips of silk satin cut on the bias and creating this wrap around the body, because it's these strips that are about 4 or 5 inches wide. It's difficult to see in the photo, but when you see it in person, you're really struck by that detail, as well as the pleating addition of the trim at the end. Those are also very remarkable. So a little bit on jewelry before we head out. Joel Haupt was a little known purveyor of jewelry, and in the 1930s, people were very conscious about not being too flashy. So even though there's diamonds and these are all platinum pieces, there was a move to use semi-precious stones like zircon. So these examples purchased by Marjorie Post in the late 30s kind of continue the carryover of Deco design in Paris, while also embracing this new restraint, if you will. Finally, again, Pecan, she hasn't forgotten about Pecan. And at this point, she purchases this dress. It's dated about 1949, and it's probably by the second or third to last designer before the fashion house of Pecan closes, Lou Clavier, who's French Basque. And these are, it's just a typical silhouette of the period, really full skirt, which is he's known for. And also, I love the very distinct kind of epaulette design on the right shoulder that you're looking at the very top. So I wanted to share that detail with you here too, that all of these designers that she's encountering as a young girl are continuing to influence her shopping habits, and she's loyal to these designers. finally, we are just gonna stop for a tiny bit more jewelry, and then I'm gonna say goodnight to everybody. So we're off to Van Cleef and Arpels. And for this particular brooch, we actually have the invoice of when she purchased this. It's called the Marguerite brooch is the style, and she purchased it on a trip to Paris that was actually in conjunction with her grandson Antal's wedding that happened in September of 1969, so we know that. And what I love about this brooch is it's a wonderful example of the technology that Van Cleef pioneered as fine jewelers, which is the mystery setting, where you don't really, it almost has the effect of a micro mosaic. So you're looking at these calibri cut rubies that really resemble the texture of a flower petal, and then you're thinking all these grooves were cut into the back so they could be fit to these rails or wires that you're not seeing as you look at this incredible brooch. So we'll always have Paris, and thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining me on this trip, and I hope no one got too jet lagged, and I hope to see you all in life soon, in person soon. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Megan. And Wilfried, I hope, is going to turn back on his camera and join us for some questions and answers before folks head out. Thank you again to everyone for joining us. My name is Erin Lurie. I manage Hillwood's adult public programs, and I'll be moderating the Q&A. We've got a couple that have already started coming in, but please do not be shy. We want to hear from you. You can submit those through the Q&A module. You might have to tap your screen to make that toolbar pop up. And I also want to say a special thanks to those of you who were active in the chat this evening. It was lovely to hear from folks from California, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Florida, Virginia, and of course, many friends around the corner here in the DC area. Thank you so much for being with us virtually. That's one of the things that we really appreciate about these Zoom opportunities, is that you don't have to be in our backyard to join us. So please send in more questions, but I'm going to start off with a couple here. Megan, I'm going to start you with a softball. We have a question from Rhonda Bernstein asking about the name of Calat Sor and what it means.
So that's their surname. Sor is sister in French, so it's the family name.
Thank you. Early on, as Wilfried was wrapping up, there was a mention about the Replica Titanic. And Lynn Romberg asked whether people would be very hesitant to travel on that.
Well, that's a very good question. And actually, I mean, I assume they were like worried at one point, but the first thing they did, as I remember, if they doubled the numbers of the lifeboats on the other ships that were built like the Titanic. So I think the main issue that the Titanic had was solved by this action. So.
Excellent. Megan, you also mentioned one piece that was a 250 franc cost for one of the dresses. Do you happen to know what the equivalent of that fee would be today?
Probably in the thousands of dollars. I'm trying to think of which one I said was 250 franc. I don't remember. Was that me?
I think it came in during your program.
Oh, okay.
But I may have missed it because a couple of them came in right around the same time. So we will see if we can find out more on that and get back to you,
yeah.
Lynn. Could either of you comment about post-social activities in terms of any events or concerts, art shows, or nightlife that she might have attended, such as opera or ballet or impressionist art exhibitions and cuisine?
Well, I was the one who presented a bit about the social life, which was an interest in Paris. So, of course, when you came to Paris, so I mentioned these two main events. Unfortunately, I mean, the scrapbooks that we have regarding, you know, Marjorie Post life are not all, you know, very detailed. It's not, you know, an everyday diary and all of that. So we don't have necessarily her everyday, you know, details about what she did. So the main events I shared are the one I shared, but we know she visited museums for sure. She will attend theater sometimes, as you know, we know from one program we have, but unfortunately we don't have so many details. But we are starting to work on these, you know, trips to Paris specifically. So we hope to find more. But like the main events and aspect of the social life were shared tonight.
Excellent. Arlene asked earlier whether any of the Cartier pieces were donated to the Natural History Museum, and she also wondered what gowns are on display in the mansion right now for those who are able to come and visit us in person.
Okay, so for the Cartier pieces, there are some that were fitted by Cartier, like the emerald necklace. And then we also have, so yes, the Natural Museum of History has the emerald necklace that was purchased at Cartier. And then with the Mughal carved emeralds. And then there's also a few other pieces that were fitted by Cartier. And then the other, there we have a it's not on display now, but it's a seed pearl bag that has tutti frutti cut gems by Cartier that I love, and it hasn't been on display yet, so we're hoping to get a loan for that, and that one was purchased at Cartier Paris. And I actually wanted to include it in this particular lecture, but there's so much French beautiful things that I wanted to include, so I had to cut it down because I didn't want this to be the duration of a flight to Paris. So yeah, there are a few pieces. You know, Cartier would refit gems and jewels, but we have quite a few Cartier at Hillwood. So.
We've also gotten a couple of questions about fashion houses and designers that Marjorie Post frequented and who still is around today, as well as whether any of the ateliers are in their same locations in Paris now.
Let me see. So I'm just going in to look. Okay. So she, to my knowledge, at this moment, we're not sure if she shopped at Chanel. So I saw that as a big question. We don't have any Chanel pieces extant in our collection now. The way that she kept her clothing in terms of what we have at Hillwood is related a lot to occasion, especially for this earlier period. So, you know, if it's a wedding gown, for instance, or something that our daughters wore, those pieces were definitely kept. But the later you get, you know, it becomes more of a wardrobe of what it was at Hillwood when she was living in the 1950s and on. And during that time period, she was working pretty regularly with a dress maker in New York called Aldrich Royce, who immigrated to the US early on and set up shop. And he had all of her sizes and knew her taste really well. So later in life, after the 30s and 40s, she was primarily working with him.
And here is one more question that is after my very own heart. And I think this will be our last question today. I appreciate everyone for sending in some fabulous thoughts, but we did get a question about how Post organized her clothes, and in particular, whether she ordered duplicates and whether they were for different homes. As we know, she spent different seasons up in New York and Palm Beach and spent spring and fall here in Washington.
So that's a really wonderful question. And I have observed that she does purchase a lot of duplicates in different colorways or slight shifts in style. You saw the piguet gowns on my slide from the late 1930s. This is a practice that I think we all do, but we don't do it with couture. But she was doing this often. And now in terms of it being pieces that would be at one house and then she'd have the pink piguet at, you know, Mar-a-Lago or something, that I'm not 100% sure of, you know, whether she bought with intent to have a piguet option at one house or another, but she definitely found what she wanted to wear, loved it, and ordered more, or already knew she was going to love it, so put an order in for 2 at once. Organizing, she had, particular to Hillwood, she has, of course, the 2 closets that are downstairs in the bedroom suite, and then some of her pieces, especially kind of the older pieces and the sentimental pieces, she kept upstairs, as well as more of her wardrobe, which is now textile storage, so it's full circle. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for a great presentation, Megan and Wilfried. I am not feeling so much jet lag as I am feeling invigorated, and like I am going to be very disappointed in the patisserie upstairs in my kitchen. But thank you for joining us, and thank you for tuning in again from across the country. When the webinar ends, you should be prompted to visit SurveyMonkey. We rely on your feedback to help improve our programs, and it's especially valuable as we are all still learning this virtual world of lectures through Zoom. So I hope that you'll join us again soon for upcoming programs. Our next lecture is on August 5th, as curator Rebecca Tillis will share some of the new discoveries she's made in her first 2 years at Hillwood. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Bye.